right?
Alrighty. Thank you for joining us at the 2021 MSU Comics Forum. We're back from our break. I'm happy to introduce the panel being led by Sydney Heifler. This is our panel on fashion, bodies, and sex. Sydney, take it away.
Yeah, so I'm gonna start my screen share, which is gonna be exciting for everyone. Okay, so I'm Sydney Heifler. I'm really excited to be starting off this roundtable, Fashion, Bodies, and Sex, Girls Comics and the Construction of the Teenage Girl. With me today, I have Trina Robbins and Joan Ormrod, who are both really awesome and agreed to do this panel with me extremely last minute. I don't feel like either of them particularly needs an introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm going to start with Joan. Joan is a senior lecturer in the Department of Media at Manchester Metropolitan University. She specializes in teaching subcultures, comics, fantasy, and girlhood, and she has published widely on all these topics. Her monograph, Wonder Woman, The Female Body in Popular Culture, was published by Bloomsbury in February 2020. The paperback for this book comes out in June, but in the United States, I think it will appear in August. I checked for myself, of course. I absolutely adore Joan and everything she has done for comic studies. So it's going to be impossible, of course, to list everything that Trina has accomplished over the years, but I'm going to name a few of the highlights. In 1970, she produced the first all-women comic, It Ain't Me, Babe. In 1972, she became a founding mother of women's comics, the longest-lasting women anthology comic book. In the mid-1980s, she co-wrote with Catherine Ironwood, Women and the Comics, the first of a historical series on women cartoonists. In 1986, she became the first woman to draw a Wonder Woman comic. She also, of course, created Misty in California Girls, which she will be talking about today. In 2013, Trina became a Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame inductee, and in 2017, an Eisner winner. As a historian, she is responsible for rediscovering forgotten women cartoonists like Nell Brinkley and Lily Renee. And on that note, she also has a book coming out in August about Gladys Parker, which I'm also extremely excited about. I said I was Sydney Heifler. I'm a first-year PhD student at The Ohio State University. I do not have any books coming out anytime soon. However, I have been researching romance comics for 8 years. I'm extremely excited to be here today. I'm also serving as moderator, which means I have the extreme displeasure of trying to keep everyone to time. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with Joan. She'll give an introduction of her research in this topic, and then I will go, and then Trina will go, and then we're going to open up to discussion and then questions. So Joan, I'm going to hand it off to you, and you just tell me as you want me to move through the slides.
Okay, can you start with the first one? Right.
Yeah.
This thing it's a snapshot really, and it's the context for the paper that I've been working on, which is part of a much bigger project. But it's centering on UK girls comics from the mid-1950s up until the mid-1970s. And this part of the project is about the new woman and the active female body. And so I've put some images to the left, which I'll be picking up later on when we get into more talks. So the first one on the left is a little zingy body, and that's kind of an editorial body. The one in the middle is the Getaway Girls, who are a bunch of models who go around the world. The one on the right is a girl who is thinking about going to New York. And the one underneath is part of the Spy Girls genre that started up in the mid-60s. And this is Camilla, the danger girl, who's been chucked out of a helicopter without a parachute, or a parachute that works. And so these are all of the things that link into the new woman and the active female body from the mid-1960s in British comics. And so the things that I'm looking at are movement from the urban to the, from the rural to the urban, and from the small town to the city, holidays, daydreams. So it's spatial and also psychological movement. I'm also looking at the Spanish and Italian artists who came into Britain and drew a lot of these images, and also spy girls and fashion girls. So if you can go to the next slide. Right, these are the comics I'm talking about. It started off with Marilyn in 1955, which is the middle one on the right there. And Marilyn was published by IPC. and as was Mirabelle, Roxy, and Valentine. And the one at the bottom, the Romeo, that was published by D.C. Thompson, which was a Dundee company. Now, up until 1964, these were the main Romeo, the main romance comics. In 1964, Jackie came out and blew the whole lot out of the water. I haven't got to Jackie yet. If you can give me the next slide. This is the sort of things I'm looking at with girls' comics. They're different from American comics. Like American comics in the 60s, they were distributed through newsagents, but they were weekly. And there were two types, and they were based on whatever the publishers' printing presses were set up for. So you had a comics format like Romeo on the left, made out of cheap newsprint and a smallish format. And on the right, the Mirabelle, which was more of a magazine format, printed on shiny paper with a high sort of profile and a bit more expensive. They were also anthologies. So you had more than one story in them. You had 5 or 6. Some of them were serials. You had pop and fashion articles and advice columns, but some of these were also shown as picture stories. And you also had free gifts, not cut out dolls, but things like badges, brooches, and I've got some that I can show if anyone wants to see them later on. Next slide, please. This is the last one. Sorry, the second last one. This is the methodology. I'm going from Penny Tinkler's idea of showing the relationship between text, images, and design features, and also production. And next one. Right. And so this is where I'm sort of finishing here, because this is around about the mid-60s, and you get the growth of this idea of the active female body. And it comes from this notion of the new woman. The new woman came from Dr. Eric Dichter, who was a researcher in focus groups and audiences in New York. And he was commissioned by IPC to look at Woman's Own, which was a woman's magazine. And he came out with this idea that women were more interested in lifestyle than in class and age, etc. And at this time, you also get this growth of these magazines, which were aimed at teenage girls. And here we have Twiggy as she breaks in the mid-60s on the front. And I'll stop there. Have I done me 5 minutes?
I think so, but we have more slides to look at later if you have more you want to say.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Joan. So we're gonna, I guess, jump into my section now. So in the romance comics I researched, the sexuality of the teenage girl is a very dangerous thing. My article, Romance Comics, Dangerous Girls and the Importance of Fathers, explored how romance comics of the 50s suggested that fathers or father figures were in charge of controlling their daughter's sexuality and sexual growth. And if they failed to do so, what would happen is young girls would get overwhelmed by their sexuality and experience what I guess today we would term mental health issues. Since I've done this article, I've become very interested in how these comics indicate moments of dangerous sexual expression, are hinted at such future moments to come through the interactions of teenage girls with their clothes. So we have an example right away of this in The Branded Me Immoral, which is one of my favorite stories, where Jan is supposed to marry Stan, and we already know that's a horrible idea because they have rhyming names and that's gross. But she's actually in love with Joe, who's much more sexually exciting. And so she wants to run away. Well, right here, she wants to have a date with Joe, and the father is blocking it. And you can tell that she's about to misbehave because she's clutching this beautiful red dress, which apparently that's the only color that men really knew about at this time, because all fashionable clothes are red in romance comics, which also serves for danger. So she ends up running away with Joe, and they elope, and her life is kind of ruined because everyone thinks they eloped because she got pregnant out of wedlock. But this one kind of ends happy, which is unusual, in that they decide to stick it out and stay married anyway and stay in the town. But then it's okay to be sexually attractive and wear beautiful dresses as long as your father is in charge of this sexual expression and your body. So what we have here is a wonderfully creepy story in which this girl wants to look very pretty for the dance, and she doesn't feel like any men like her. So her father's like, it's okay, I got this. And he goes shopping and picks out all of her clothes and comes back. And you can see here that he's in her room with her while she's in her lingerie putting on makeup. And he says, my daughter's going to knock him dead, or I'll know why. And then we have like a weird kind of father of the bride moment where her date comes and is blown away by her beauty. And she goes to the dance and all the men love her and she has dates for days. And so it's okay to be sexually attractive and wear fashionable clothing as long as your father controls that. So it's interesting. But then we get to the 1970s and we have where comic book creators kind of tried to make the stories a little bit more empowering, where girls could kind of control the clothes that they wore and their sexuality. But of course, this did not play out very well. And this is a story, Daughter of Women's Lib, which I love. And I cannot actually read what I put there, but she's just like, I was a girl in hot pants driven to steal a boy's job, a boy I loved. I was the daughter of Women's Lib. And you can see here that her mother, a feminist, is very upset about this. And she says, I mean, this outfit, letting this male chauvinist use you as a sex object. And she's like, but I'm a sex object by my own choice. And but her boyfriend ends up getting fired because the boss likes her more because she's sexually attractive and bringing in customers. And so she's all empowered, but then her boyfriend dumps her and she realizes that she should only dress to please her boyfriend. So she quits her job and that's how the story ends. So it didn't really work out. But what I have to mention that we had Liz Ruby working for DZ. And so Liz Ruby actually did a lot of really, really great fashion work. And she had a lot of advice articles that were in comic book form. And in these articles, we do have women, or young girls, I should say, interacting with fashion for their own pleasure. And it's usually not really suggested that it's tied to their sexuality. So we have this article, Legs, which shows you how to wear tights and socks. And I'm just obsessed. And I would wear like every single one of these outfits. But I should say the earlier advice articles in romance comics were not so empowering. They were all about, well, this is how you dress to get a fiance, and that was basically them all. Or if you were married, here's how to dress to please your husband. And so I'm gonna hand it off to Trina now for the sake of time, who's going to walk us through some really exciting slides. I'm very excited. Trina, you let me know as you want me to move forward.
Yes, thank you. Okay, once upon a time, there were girls' comics. This is from 1948, I believe. Yes. Okay, can we have the next one?
Yes.
And here's Millie the model. These were all published by early Marvel, when Marvel wasn't called Marvel yet, it was called Timely or Atlas. And the artist is Dan DeCarlo. Go on, next.
Hold on, it's being weird. There we go.
And Katie Keene. Katie Keene was amazing. This was published by Archie Comics. And the gimmick that they had was that readers sent in designs for the clothing, and they credited the readers for the designs. Next panel. And all of these books featured paper dolls or fashions. This one is Millie the Model's Fashions. Next, please. And here's Katie Keene's Kitchen Fashions. And you can see that they're all credited. And it's a little amazing because they would never do this today. Their entire addresses are listed, which I guess in those days, people were simply safer. Next. So who read these books? Who read these books? I did. I and my girlfriends. This could easily be my girlfriends and me. And you can see, in fact, that the girl in front is reading a comic called Hetty. And that was Hetty Devine, who was an actress. The girls were everything. Some of them were just high school students. Some of them, like Millie, were models, actresses, nurses, but they were all about the girls. All right, so what happened to these amazingly popular books? Next. This is what happened. This is a 1979 reprint, but it's a reprint of a book from 1963. Sorry. what happened was the Marvel Renaissance, a new way of looking at superheroes that became so popular that basically Marvel just threw the girls' comics under the bus in order to have these comics, these superhero comics. And the superhero comics took over to the detriment of girls' comics. And soon there was nothing for girls to read. There was only superhero comics for boys and men. Go on, next. Okay, 20 years later, I decided, because there was nothing there for girls anymore, I decided to try to do a series for girls based on the series that I had read as a kid. And I named her Misty, and she was the niece of Millie the model. So there was continuity. And I actually convinced Jim Shooter, who was then the editor, to do a 6-part miniseries. This is number 1. Next. And it included paper dolls that designs that had been sent in by readers, as you can see. And it was enormously popular. I would receive, my editor would send me mail, because we had a letter column. They would send me mail every month, huge manila envelopes loaded with fashion designs and loaded with letters. But one of the things that they all said was, I love Misty, but I don't know how to find it. Because the comic book stores at this point only carried comics for boys. The Fantastic Four, X-Men, Spider-Man, Superman, Batman, and you couldn't find these books. Next, please. Okay, so after 6 issues, I went on. I wasn't about to give up that easily. I went on to Eclipse Comics, and I did California Girls, which was the same kind of comic, actually, except that the California Girls were twins, Max and Mo, and they also included paper dolls. Can you go to the next panel, please? This, I really got to let loose on the paper dolls. I got to be very creative because Eclipse was black and white, but they had full color inserts in the middle, and that was the paper dolls. So, you know, this, I want to tell you, this works. I did it and it cut it out and it works. Next, please. And they featured a designer of the month. Every month they featured a new designer. Here's 14-year-old Tracy Tso and her drawings. So next, please. Okay, this is the last image, but I have lots more to talk about. So what killed Misty and what killed California Girls was the comic book stores who wouldn't carry them because they were for girls. And it would be another 20 or 30 years before we came out again with comics for girls. That's it.
Okay, that is it. Okay, so we are now, I'm trying to figure out we can stop screen share for a second. So we are now going to discuss things and then for about 11 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to discussion, questions from the audience. Trina, you had mentioned that you had more you wanted to talk about. So do you want to start off our discussion?
That I had what? I'm sorry.
You said you had much more that you wanted to talk about. Do you want
to
start
yeah,
off?
Sure. Well, you know, the girls' comics that I showed you, especially the ones by Timely, also had comics for boys. Maybe you could show very quickly Georgie, Oscar, Willie, and Georgie,
yes,
Oscar, and Willie.
Share my screen again. Okay, so let me go. It's here somewhere. Okay. To get through all of these. Okay, that was it. There's Georgie.
No. You're seeing the red dress here. There we are. There we are. And you'll see, by the way, if you've been looking at the covers, you'll see that they feature a kind of a light romance. The teenage boy is funny looking, but he really loves the pretty girl. Can you show the other two?
Yeah, there's Oscar, on my side at least.
And the next one.
Well, I love this one.
Yes, yes. So, so they had comics for boys too, and boys read them and girls read them too.
Yeah. But you said Archie was kind of marketed to both boys and girls. Would you say
Yes,
that's true?
yes,
Okay.
yes. And if you ask certain women about did they read comics when they were kids, they will say, "Oh yeah," and they won't call it Archie. They won't say, "I read Archie." They'll say, "I read Betty and Veronica," because
Mhm.
that was what they related to, was Betty and Veronica, the two girls, not really Archie.
I think that's true. Joan, did you want to weigh in on this or have anything else you would like to mention about your other slides?
I, well, I could link it into what Trina's been talking about, because the girls' comics that I'm talking about were also read by boys, and you would get articles in them saying, here's some fashion for your boyfriend. So there was an audience for boys there. And up until the late 60s, they had huge audiences. They started out with 500,000 per week. And by the end of the 60s, some of them had gone down to something like 150,000, which is still a pretty good amount of a pretty big audience. But as I said, Jackie in 1964 really started coming to its own by the end of the 60s and into the 70s. But the fashion element was huge in these comics. As you can see from here, we have the influence of the Avengers and that pop spy aesthetic coming through. And this is sort of linked into mod culture in the UK, because in the UK we had mini skirts appearing which were
Mhm.
by Mary Quant, and specifically for bodies like Twiggy, who was a new kind of model. And if you go to there on the right, this is an image by a guy called Alan Parry, and he did a lot of the drawings. But within weeks of Twiggy coming out in the mid 60s, he was drawing these images, which are sort of drawings based on Twiggy and the sort of pop aesthetic figure. But it's a very active figure. And what was happening was a lot of these images were coming from boutiques, because this is the place where a lot of these clothes were promoted and sold, and the models who they were sold on the bodies of were active models as well. They would dance up the aisles, or they would be on podiums go-go dancing. So that's kind of the sort of movement and active body from what I've been talking about. If you go to the slide active female bodies in the 1960s, which
That after or before?
before, keep
Oh,
going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep
is
going.
it?
There, that one. It starts around the mid 60s, where you get these more active figures, and you get rhetoric based on young individual fun. Z is for zany and zest, and this is that drawn figure. I think that might be by Alan Parry as well. I might be wrong there, but you start getting these girls jumping around in the comics, whereas before they had been quite sedate and quite sort of traditional looking. But this is called sort of the active female figure is part of modernity and part of the sort of movement of girls from the domestic space into the public space, because a lot of them were getting jobs in offices. I won't go on because it's sort of taking away from everyone else.
Yeah, I love it though. I love it. I'm going to tie in something about my research to that. But before I do that, I wanted to bring up that reminded me of Trina's Misty comic, where her characters are also depicted as more active than what we see in some of the stuff that I research in the romance comics. And I wanted to say that men also, or boys also read the romance comics that I researched, but it was often kind of more hidden, and they didn't really want to admit it, and they kind of took the copies of their sisters. But these women, but I think it's obvious that some of these scenes are drawn for men, are from the male perspective, such as this one, I Paid the Price, which we once again have a young woman in a red dress, and she's at college, and she is failing at math, and so she tries to flirt with her professor, who's like, obviously you didn't have a good father figure, and spanks her. And then she's like, oh, I should try harder at studying, and she does, and she gets an A, and they fall in love and they get married. And so like we always like, I just feel like men must have read this and identify like with it in some weird, strange, perverse way, because I feel like the story wasn't exactly written for the women. But so that's my little addition. Or we have Man Hater again, where she's in a red dress because she hates men. She cracks her way.
This Jezebel starring Bette Davis. You know, in the 19, I think it was
yes.
9 ago. Yeah, she sort of goes to this ball wearing a red dress and scandalized.
I do not know that one. Oh, and this, I put this in for Trina. It's a Matt Baker.
Yes.
Of the woman that this is supposed to be a teenager, by the way. I'd never met a teenager look quite like that, but this is a teenage girl in a very fashionable red bathing suit. Trina, do you want to say anything about this, or Matt Baker?
Actually, all that you say about the red dresses, I do another talk in which I show a series of red dresses. It was what the guys did when the guys were drawing comics. They always put the heroines in red dresses. But when women did comics, their dresses were very fashionable and not necessarily red.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I'm having some something in the chat. Keep talking.
Speaking of,
okay.
you know, you were sort of talking about spanking. That was about popular culture in the 50s. It was
true.
Supposed to be sexy, and it was supposed to be what women really wanted. I mean, she's looking as though she's really quite enjoying it. She's not unenjoying it. This is such a word as
No, and I mean, you know, Michael Goodrum wrote that article about Lois Lane, and that went over quite a bit of the spanking in that as well. It definitely, and I did a paper on the early Batman with Catwoman, and there's a lot of spanking of Catwoman as well. So it's definitely something that's occurring in the comics, all over the place.
Spirit also, in the Spirit, there's a very famous image of the Spirit spanking Ellen Dolan. People thought it was cute. They thought it was cute and funny.
Weirdly, I haven't spanking comics, weirdly. Perhaps they were too busy spanking other people, you know? So
okay. So we're coming up, we have 1 minute before we should start taking audience questions, and we do have a few. So I want to make sure to get to those. Is there any last minute things that either of you want to mention?
Maybe you could show the other attempts. Mine was not the only attempt in the middle 1980s to bring back girls comics. Maybe you could show Angel Love and Vicky Valentine.
Oh yeah, so here's I'm putting Angel Love up first.
That's by Barbara Slate.
Yes, and then we have Vicky Valentine.
And show the paper dolls too.
Oh yes, that's a good point.
Bob Rausch.
Yeah, I find Vicky Valentine really interesting because the style to me is so much more romantic and girly than some of the other styles.
Barb was very girly. Barb had started as a teenager sending in designs to Katie Keene. But of course, these two comics also failed. They failed because the comic book stores wouldn't carry them.
Which is unfortunate.
Extremely unfortunate.
I love them. Okay, I think we're going to turn to questions now. We have 15 minutes left for questions. I'm going to stop screen sharing. How do I do that? Nope. Did I have it? Oh, there we go. Stop share. Okay. So we have in the Q&A, we want to start with, what? Joan?
You want me to go onto camera?
Yes, that would be great. Then they can see your face. Okay.
Right.
So we have a question for Joan. I'm just going to go through them in order. Is there any way we can see or be directed to the brochures that you mentioned?
Yes, I have one here. This is, I hope you can see that. It's Anthony Newley. It's a disc that you could get, and you could send away for it. It cost something like 12 and 6, which was a ridiculously low amount of money. And it was a screen test. And what you could do was you could pretend you were on a date with a famous star like Anthony Newley, and you would get a script with it, and you played it on the record player, and then you could fill in the gaps in the script. He would sort of say something, and then you would fill them in. And then there's this one, which is a date with the Beatles. This is from the Boyfriend magazine, but there's a fantastic one. It was on the front of that Romeo that I had put an image on. And when the Beatles were in America, there was a free gift in there, and it was a cutout of the Beatles that you could stand up and you could play the Beatles record and pretend they were there with you.
Oh,
Fantastic stuff. That the early stories and the early comics from the UK, you would get brooches and things like that as free gifts. So one of the earliest was a little free guitar, a little guitar brooch that you could stick on your lapel. And there was a little story to go with it to say, I got this and it's very lucky for me. So if you use my little lucky guitar, it might bring you luck. And this was a famous pop star of the time, which you probably have never heard of, called Tommy Steele. But there was all sorts of things like that. And, you know, they were just fantastic comics for girls, you know. The
Yeah.
younger got the cutout dolls, by the way, Trina. So you got cutout dolls in Bunty and things like that.
yes, I know. I also collect, when I go to England, I look for the old girls' magazines
Mhm.
and I collect them.
Yeah, they're getting very expensive now. I mean,
Yeah,
these are
I am going broke. I have a question. I think that if any of us will be able to answer, it will most likely be Trina. It says, early Fantastic Four focuses a lot on Sue's clothing and hairstyles. To what extent is that a folding of the girls' comic aesthetic into the superhero genre? Do you think that there's sort of the connection between that? I personally do not know the answer to this question.
I don't know specifically, but I think that this was their effort to include girls. I mean, that seems pretty obvious.
Yeah.
There was sort of Wasp and the Wasp,
Yes.
Janet Van Dyne and Sue Storm would always go out on a shopping spree.
Yes, they were always going shopping.
I know a bit about the Wasp, and I will say that I don't know. Like everyone always asks me if the Wasp and the Ant-Man were a romance comic, and I think that they had elements of that, but I do not. I do. Oh, someone wants to answer this question live. I don't know what.
Well,
that
the
means.
women, the superheroines, definitely had partners, male partners, who, you know, at least some of them. I mean, the Wasp did, and you know, Sue Storm did.
Yeah, that's true. And then, okay, here's a good question that I quite like a lot. It says, it feels like the examples you were talking about have predecessors in the newspapers before the floppy became a thing. Can you speak to those as well as this, as part of this larger continuity? So I think, yeah, there were definitely, Trina, you know a lot about this. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, there were paper dolls in the newspapers, and there were female characters who were the heroines of their strips. I'm thinking of Dixie Dugan, for instance. Lots of others, Invisible Scarlet O'Neill, and some of them did include comics because girls read them. And this is kind of the sign. Have I already said this? That the sign that this is a comic that women and girls are going to like is that they have paper dolls.
You got paper dolls as well. It's like what's her name? Shirley Temple. There
Oh,
were
yes.
temple
I watched those.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mm,
Okay,
and
so
also
here's oh, sorry. Joan, I talked over you. Can you repeat that?
What was that?
I can't.
sorry, it was magnetic.
Oh, dear. We're losing your voice.
Every time, yeah. Do you want to turn your video off, Joan? Because I think your video audio is going out a little bit. And while you, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to now do. There's lots of great questions in here. It's very hard to pick. So here's a question for all panelists. I'm curious about the difference in the expected audience engagement across these examples. I feel like we actually might have addressed that. How important is that element and what is lost when it isn't present? So I feel like we've touched on audience engagement quite a bit. Romance comics were very popular in the early 50s.
And the people who sent in, the fans who sent in paper dolls for Katie Keene and other books also had paper dolls that fans sent in designs for.
And I will say, romance comics didn't really have paper dolls, but they did get fan letters and they did get letters, and they did cut that out and start reprinting them. But then there was an effort later on to actually answer real letters again, and that kind of helped with the popularity. So, Joan, did you have another answer for that question?
Well, so far as the Mirabelle's concerned, which is the one that I've been doing a lot of work on, they didn't actually have much engagement with the audiences until around about 1965, 66, when they had a letters page, and they encouraged fans to write in with DIY images, drawings, drawings of pops. But that's the first one. I think there was much less than there was in America, but then I could be wrong.
Okay, so I have another question. How do girls find these comics? I find it hard to find feminist-oriented comics at stores even today. Well, I think Trina made a point that it was very hard for them to find her comics and some of the other girls' comics.
Yes, but that was later. That was in the 80s.
Yes.
But originally, the ones from the 40s and 50s and even early 50s, you could get on the newsstands.
Yeah,
because
magazine.
they didn't have comic book stores. It was really comic book stores that killed diversity in comics because all they wanted to carry was superheroes for boys.
Yeah, that aligns with my findings on the 50s romance comics. They were magazine racks, newspaper stands, and also sometimes they would distribute them to hotels and such. Joan, I'm curious, how does this differ in the UK for the UK comics?
They just continued to be distributed in newsstands, newsagents, and they would have a counter with all of the girls and boys comics on it, and they would have a little twirly rack for all the American ones, which were really sort of sought after and quite expensive. But yeah, I think it differed in the UK because the audiences started falling off by around about the mid to late 70s. And it wasn't because of comic books shops, it was because of television and also because of the magazines for teenage girls, which girls, they would go from girl comics like Bunty and Judy straight into the magazines. So that's the difference. And also the Jackie. Jackie just took over the market, really.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, we have another one for all panelists. Do the panelists feel like their findings and their research is relevant to today's comics? Has there been any significant change in the distribution of women's comics and the variety of stories? Who wants to go first on that one?
Well, there are so many more women drawing comics and so many more comics for girls and women today that it's completely different. And the reason it's different is because these tend to be graphic novels and you can find them in bookstores.
Yeah, and I would say that I as a consumer, like well, I feel like my research does relate to today's, because there's a lot of romance comics out, modern romance comics out today that try to take these sort of problematic themes and subvert them. But in terms of finding them, I definitely I look online, especially with the pandemic. I just buy a lot of the comics online. It makes it very easy to access different types of comics now. Joan, what about you?
I think manga's taken over quite a lot. There's a lot of romance manga, you know, like The Rose of Versailles and things like that. And I think this is where comic book shops changed. In the UK, when the 70s came in, and the first comic book shops came in the UK, they had half comic books and half porn, which put a lot of girls off. But by about the mid 1990s to the 2000s, I went into comic books and half of the people in there were girls and they were looking at manga. So I think that's the latest thing. And an awful lot of women are writing autobiographical and romance comics themselves now. So I think it's a very vibrant market for women now, but it's totally different from the market that was around when I was a girl and when, you know, in the 60s and 70s.
We have 3 minutes left, so I feel like we have time for one more question. I'm going to ask this one that kind of got repeated. I'm wondering about the possibility of early influence of girls manga, or manga, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, from Japan on some of these styles of Western women's comics. Vicky Valentine in particular makes me think of girls manga.
Definitely. You know, so many girls have gotten into comics by way of manga. You know, it was manga really that is responsible for the fact that there are so many women drawing comics now, and so many comics for girls and women. Definitely.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So there is a question about how to find these comics and how to find. So I don't know how to find them, but just in terms of reaching the panelists afterwards, Joan and I are both on Twitter. You can fire some questions at us there. Joan's, I believe yours is your name. Mine's Romance Comic Books, BKS. And Trina, is there a way that people could reach you at all?
Well, I'm on Facebook and you can message me.
I'm not on Twitter, by the way.
Oh, you're not? Okay, sorry.
Book though, you
My
can
bad.
Facebook. I left Twitter, it was just too toxic.
Yeah, that makes sense. But yeah, so I'm sorry for all the people whose questions we couldn't answer, but feel free to reach out to us there. Also, we frequently speak at conferences, so catch us later. You can always catch us talking about, we always talk about romance comics. You can always catch us talking about this later. Yeah, we love to talk about comics. Any other closing remarks?
You know, we've still got 15 minutes.
Oh my gosh. I did that thing where I was thinking I cut back 15. I'm so wrong. We're going to go back through questions. I'm so sorry. That is my bad. I am operating on grad student time. Okay. So.
Could I to what we were talking about before? Because you said, what influence do these comics have nowadays? My understanding is, the link that I've made is with current practices of girls who are online, because I think it links into a lot of fan culture and what fans do now. What they were doing in those days were encouraged by the comics. You know, things like designing your own fashion, and I've seen Trina's done her own fashion as well. She was pictures of herself up. And girls were encouraged to produce their own clothing, you know, and individualize them. So anyway, I'm just throwing that in the mix.
I think of what Liz Berube did. That was, she would make fashion suggestions to the readers. You know, why not try putting this flower at your knee? You know, things like that.
I do love her fashions. They intimidate me. but I want to try them. Maybe I feel like I'd have to craft a lot of those outfits myself.
Well, this is a good time to mention that it's only in talking stage now, but I've been talking with her son. Before that, I was talking with Liz, but as we know, she passed away. So I was talking with her son about collecting her work in book form so that everyone can see her incredible comics.
I would definitely get that book. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so there is a question that now that we actually have time, and that I've been wanting to ask Trina from the comments. It says, how far off was Barbie comics from California Girls? And if you don't mind, I'm going to share screen to show those Barbie scans that you put up once I find the share screen again. Okay.
Well, as you know, or maybe you don't know, I was a writer for Barbie, one of many, and also an inker for Barbie. It was for a younger audience, actually. A younger audience. But it was fun writing it, and it was not, the thing about Barbie is it was not just, oh, let's go shopping. We told real stories. We told stories about a girl who's embarrassed because her mother is deaf, a girl who wants to be like Barbie, but she doesn't know how, and so she's starving herself. We told real stories.
Yeah, my sister is quite obsessed with your Barbie work, as you know.
I sent her all the ones I'd written, yes.
Yes, she did. She's doing some great research on Barbie and your work in that. I love this particular Barbie scan that you put in here because it reminds me of the Barbie that was in the coloring books that I had as a child. But yeah, I just wanted to share that. I'm going to now stop sharing and return to questions. And then, okay, so Joan, since we have some time, Nicole asked, how does she find these comics? I just tried searching for them and couldn't find them. That's for you, Joan.
eBay. There's a couple of in the UK that do them and they do delivery, but they're quite expensive now. I mean, when I started this work, you could get them quite cheaply for £1 or £1.50, and now they're going for about £7 or £8.
Oh my goodness.
And more. Like the first issue of Mirabelle is going for £150, which is a lot of money, £150. But
yes,
I'll turn my little thing on, and I can show you this, because before I got this. This is one of the editor's books, and it's a collection of the comics, which I absolutely love. There's the front. They're far more like the American comics in the early days. And
they remind me of the American comics.
But it's very interesting because the first issue of Romeo and the first couple of issues of Romeo, there was an awful lot of stuff from Timely come Atlas, like Millie the Model were in it. And there was also some Charlton comic romances in there that had been, they had changed the bubbles on them. I've done a bit of analysis of those, if interested. But
of course I'm interested.
Well, it's hit and miss whether you can get them on eBay or not. You can get them from Australia, the UK, sometimes America, but they're quite rare, Yeah. And I've just built up. I can't stop myself from buying the bloomin' things. But I got some from, these are French and Italian. Now this is very lush, isn't it? And the image on there is the same image that is on the front of the first issue of Mirabelle. So there was a sort of, it wasn't syndicated, but they were selling the stuff across Europe. I think there's some German issues and Spanish ones as well. But
I have a French romance comic, but it's the photo variety, like the photo comics.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Fumetti.
And I will say that I also have found some of these comics on eBay, and I think Joan, I always scan them for you and send them your way whenever I find them. They're so much fun, but like they're incredibly expensive now. Like I can't buy any Matt Baker work; it's way too expensive.
Yeah, everyone. Yeah, Matt Baker is untouchable. Luckily, I have tons of Matt Baker already.
I have one Matt Baker that I convinced someone to buy for me. I did not buy it myself.
Created on Hollywood movies, so they were drawn in a style of Hollywood. They were really, I mean, some of the drawing is absolutely gorgeous. It's
Yes, it is.
This is called Grand Hotel, which is an Italian magazine from the 1950s, going on from the mid 40s, and a lot of the early Mirabelle was taken from that. But,
okay, that
sorry,
makes sense.
I'm just
Okay.
I'm just enthusiastic. Sorry.
No, I love it. I absolutely love it.
Misty was reprinted in England.
Mm.
Oh, really?
Yes, and even in Brazil. In Brazil, they added 2 more issues drawn by someone else.
That's really cool. I did not know that.
I
So we
didn't
have
get paid.
You
They
didn't?
didn't
Okay,
even
well that's
ask-
less cool then.
No.
That's not cool.
They didn't even ask me. I had to find out because other people sent me copies.
Oh wow, that's kind of horrible, actually.
Yes, it is.
So I'm sorry that happened. Do we want to move on to another question, or do we have last minute things to say on this topic?
Why don't we move on to another question?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a spanking question. Eisner's, we love the spanking questions. Eisner's famous spirit spanking Ellen image in 1940. When and why did images of adult men spanking grown-up women in comics begin? I have no idea when they began.
I don't know either, but you could see them in the 40s.
Yeah. You could definitely see them in the 40s. They kind of been in romance comics since the beginning, not in Simon and Kirby so much, but some of the other publishers.
Well, I mentioned, the spirit spanking Ellen Dolan. That's from the 40s.
Yeah.
I'm sure there was a lot of musical things where there was a lot of spanking going on.
Oh, yeah.
In the
musicals definitely had spanking.
Yes.
Screwball comedies as well, I would have thought.
Yes, yes.
So I think it's less like when did it appear in comics and just that it's kind of been in popular culture for a long time.
Yes.
And then comics just kind of like, oh, let's put that in here. That makes sense. So
I think there's in there for you, Sydney.
There's what?
Tracing back the earliest images of spanking. You probably
that's gonna be our first book. It's gonna be a book about spanking. So we have a question. Has someone written a paper on spanking as a trope in comics and or film? Well, I mentioned Michael Goodrum's paper on Lois Lane had some sections about spanking. I don't remember if I mentioned spanking in my, I don't think I do. Trina, do you know of any, or Joan, do you know of any papers on spanking?
I don't.
Nope.
There are some wonderfully creepy blog posts where men have collected images of spanking in comics that I know about for research purposes. But it is something I really wanted to explore in my research. I just haven't quite figured out how to frame that and justify it. Okay.
You can draw parallels with movies. A lot of cowboy movies had spanking. Yes. Destry Rides Again and Jimmy Stewart.
Yes, that's true.
And as you said, the screwball comedies.
Yeah, I think it's something that's coming from the movies.
That makes sense. I love that at the end of this panel we have a firmly established spanking as a legitimate scholarly inquiry. I'm happy that we've managed to accomplish that.
Awful lot of it in porn, soft porn as well. Betty, oh, I've forgotten the second name. Betty Page. There's an
Oh,
awful
Betty
lot of
Page.
liking each other
Yeah.
and Betty Page.
That's true.
Eating and watching porn, by the way, folks.
Okay. Okay, so we have another question. This may be way off topic, but do people in the UK save things like people in the US? And does this affect your ability to find these comics?
Yes, we do. We just collect anything. It's like anybody in contemporary culture. You have people collecting all over the place. And there's a very thin line between academics and fans, because academics, like fans, just have absolutely no boundaries, and they will collect. I mean, the amount of Wonder Woman stuff I have in this
Oh,
house,
yeah.
it's just ridiculous. And bloody DC keep bringing it out. I wish they would stop. I would have some room in the house.
Academics don't have boundaries. That's pretty true. I would say. So there was a question asked a while ago that I kind of put off and I want to make sure to get to. And this is for Trina, but obviously, Joan, you can answer if you have insight as well. It's asking if you have insight into why comic shops wouldn't carry girls' comics in the era of X-Men, etc. Seems like the demand was there. What stopped them?
They simply didn't want to. The comic stores were run by young male fans in their 30s, and frequented by young male fans. And they didn't want women in their comic book stores. It was as simple as that. It never occurred to them that they could sell, to 52% of the population. Excuse me. I have a story. I talked about how, people would send in designs. And by the way, with Misty, the editor had little cards printed up that said, I belong to the Misty Designers Club. So this one guy, Sebastian, he did a design that I used, and we sent him the card. And he said, I can't find the comic. My local comic book store doesn't carry it. So I actually phoned the comic book store, and they were very impressed that I had phoned, but they refused to carry Misty, simply refused. So we sent him a copy, of course, for free. But I mean, that's the way they felt. They did not want women and girls in their store.
That's horrible.
Yeah, it's pretty much
horrible.
Yeah. There was a very interesting post.
Okay, so now we really are coming to the end time of our panel. Joan, go ahead. Whatever you were saying.
There was a post on I think it was Comic Book Historians Facebook group, and it was yesterday, I think. And the guy who posted it said that one of the reasons for the disappearance of a lot of comics were because the comic book producers and publishers wouldn't lower the cost, and instead they lowered the number of pages, and as a result of that the audience has dwindled away. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about too, because it's sort of like ended up where you got more fans who were of a certain demographic, who were sort of comic book store people. So I think that's something to take into account too.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we're officially at time. I'm not lying this time. We're at 2:15. I had a lot of fun. Thank you both so much for joining us.
This was great. Thank you so much.
I see Julian has popped up. I think he's here to wrap it up. But yeah, just thank you so much for joining and doing this panel with me.
Bye everyone then, and thanks very much.
Yes, thank you, Sydney, and Trina and Joan. You did a great job. I'm sorry we don't have more time for you to answer the legion of questions that seem to be generated by your panel. but hopefully we'll be back next year, and hopefully Sydney will return. She's a constant figure at the MSU Comics Forum, but things are changed a little bit. So hopefully we'll see her at the Comic Study Society meeting. But we are scheduled for a break. So we'll be breaking for 15 minutes and we'll return with our panel on race and representation at 2:30. Again, thank you so much to the panelists.
Thank you.
Did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
You again.
Bye.